From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Whatever other explanation there might be, an explanation is also that it is a cover-up. And this is, the president has been engaged in a cover-up all along.
White House cover-up? A CIA whistleblower has accused the Trump administration of attempting to lock down information about President Trump's request for the president of Ukraine to interfere in the 2020 election by launching an investigation into Trump's Democratic presidential rival, Joe Biden, and his son, Hunter. This comes as support for impeachment grows among House Democrats. We'll speak with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist James Risen. Then to Egypt, where at least 2,000 people have been arrested over the past week as mass protests grow against President Trump's favorite dictator. Yes, that's what he called him, his favorite dictator, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi.
Trump and Sisi have fomented a very close relationship, devoid of any kind of criticism of each other. But this, in one way, it could be dangerous that it further emboldens Sisi to crack down even further without even the kind of muted criticism that we heard from previous administrations.
We'll speak to Democracy Now! Correspondent Sharif Abdel-Quddus. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump faces the biggest political crisis of his career after the publication of bombshell complaints accusing the president of abusing his power for personal gain. In the 9-page document, an unnamed government whistleblower, who's been identified as a CIA official, writes, quote, "The President of the United States is using the power of his office to solicit interference from a foreign country in the 2020 U.S. election," unquote. The complaint corroborates a rough transcript of a July 25th phone call released by the White House Wednesday, showing Trump repeatedly pressuring Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to launch a corruption probe into Trump's campaign rival Joe Biden and his son Hunter Biden. The complaint also reveals details about how the White House attempted to, quote, lock down all records of Trump's phone conversation soon after it happened by moving a transcript of the call to a standalone computer system reserved for code word-level intelligence information. On Thursday, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi accused the Trump administration of a cover-up.
There are actions that are cover-up. Yeah, when you have a system of electronic storage for information that is specifically for national security purposes, and you have something that is self-serving to the president politically, and decide it might not be, you might not want people to know, and you hide it someplace else.
On Capitol Hill, members of the House Intelligence Committee grilled Acting Director of National Intelligence Joseph Maguire Thursday over why he failed to quickly turn over the whistleblower's complaint to Congress after the Inspector General of the intelligence community found it to be credible and urgent. Maguire cited White House claims of executive privilege for the delay, calling the case unique and unprecedented.
I am not partisan, and I am not political. I believe in a life of service, and I'm honored to be a public servant. First, I want to stress that I believe that the whistleblower and the Inspector General have acted in good faith throughout. I have every reason to believe that they have done everything by the book and followed the law.
President Trump lashed out Thursday over the growing scandal, calling reporters scum and animals, and comparing the whistleblower to a treasonous spy who deserved the death penalty. Trump made the remarks to a closed-door gathering of diplomats on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly in New York. Audio of his remarks was leaked to the Los Angeles Times.
Who's the person who gave the whistleblower the information? Because that's close to a spy. You know what we used to do in the old days when we were smart, right? The spies and treason. We used to handle it a little differently than we do now.
After headlines, we'll speak with national security correspondent James Risen of The Intercept, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, about the growing scandal. In climate news, hundreds of thousands of school children have walked out of classes in cities around the world for the second straight Friday in the latest round of strikes demanding urgent action on the climate crisis. Today's climate protests began with marches by tens of thousands of New Zealanders. The strikes were inspired by 16-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg, who's due to speak to climate strikers in Montreal, Canada, later today. Meanwhile, a new report finds global wheat harvests are increasingly under threat as the climate crisis accelerates. The report in the peer-reviewed journal Science Advances finds that without radical action to mitigate climate change, extreme droughts will threaten 60% of the world's current wheat-producing regions by the end of the century. Attorneys general from 17 states have joined a lawsuit challenging the Trump administration's attempts to roll back the Endangered Species Act. Under the proposed rule changes, regulators would be allowed to factor in economic considerations when granting endangered status. Species classified as threatened would see their protections weakened, and scientists would be limited in setting climate change-related protections. California Attorney General Javier Becerra says collapsing ecosystems show the need to strengthen, not weaken, protections for endangered species.
And these ecosystems are facing unprecedented threat in the form of our climate crisis, habitat loss, and a myriad other threats. In fact, in a recent report issued by the United Nations, we learned that 1 million of the Earth species are under threat. And just last week, we learned that North America has lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. Now is the time to strengthen our planet's biodiversity, not to destroy it.
A Senate committee voted along party lines Wednesday to advance President Trump's nominee to lead the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Aurelia Skipworth is a former executive at the chemical and agribusiness giant Monsanto. The Guardian reports she has ties to the Westlands Water District in California's Central Valley, which has worked to roll back protections for endangered populations of Chinook salmon and other species. The Trump administration claimed without evidence Thursday California is failing to protect its residents from water pollution caused by homeless populations in San Francisco and Los Angeles. Environmental Protection Agency Chief Andrew Wheeler said in a letter to California Governor Gavin Newsom, California is failing to enforce the Clean Water Act. Wheeler's letter came 3 days after he threatened to pull billions of dollars in federal highway funding to California, accusing it of having the worst air quality in the U.S. California and nearly 24 other states filed a lawsuit earlier this month challenging the Trump administration's efforts to roll back California's more stringent tailpipe emissions standards. A spokesperson for Governor Newsom called Trump's moves, quote, political retribution against California, plain and simple. And San Francisco Mayor London Breed said, quote, there are no needles washing out to the bay or ocean from our sewer system, and there is no relationship between homelessness and water quality in San Francisco. It's just not a real issue, he said. In Egypt, thousands of protesters defied a police crackdown on dissent and took to the streets of Cairo and other Egyptian cities today, demanding the resignation of President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi over accusations of corruption. Nearly 2,000 people have been arrested at similar protests so far this week. They were triggered by social media posts by a former army contractor accusing Sisi and other officials of misusing public money. Earlier this week, President Trump praised Sisi as the two leaders met during the UN General Assembly here in New York. Later in the broadcast, we'll speak with Democracy Now! Correspondent Sharif Abdel-Quddus about Egypt's largest pro-democracy protests since the 2011 revolution. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas blasted the Trump administration Thursday over its one-sided support of Israel, saying the U.S. cannot be an honest broker for peace while it recognizes Jerusalem as Israel's capital. During his address to the UN General Assembly, President Abbas also called out Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
A week before the recent Israeli elections, Prime Minister Netanyahu came out to arrogantly announce that, should he prevail in the elections, he would annex and apply Israeli sovereignty to the Jordan Valley, the northern Dead Sea, and Israel's colonial settlements, despite the fact that all these areas are occupied Palestinian territory. We reject entirely and completely this plan.
This week, Israel's president threw Netanyahu a lifeline, giving the long-serving prime minister a chance to form a new government after last week's election provided no clear winner. The U.S. State Department said Thursday President Trump will slash the number of refugees admitted into the United States even further, from an already low 30,000 people to just 18,000 over the next year. The head of the ACLU Immigrants' Rights Project, Omar Jadwat, responded in a statement, "This administration's eagerness to unilaterally abandon our national commitment to protect people who are seeking safety from persecution, torture, and genocide is sickening. From the Muslim and refugee bans, to the asylum bans, to the severe mistreatment and separation of families seeking asylum, these attacks have been deliberate, disgraceful, and fundamentally inhumane," the ACLU's Omar Jadwat said. The Trump administration's poised to cut off food aid to 3 million people as it plans a massive rollback of SNAP. That's the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program. This week, the Agriculture Department was flooded with over 75,000 comments from activists and political leaders as a public comment period for the rule change came to a close. Among those who could be affected are as many as 500,000 school children who stand to lose access to free school meals. In Chicago, 25,000 educators have voted overwhelmingly to authorize a work stoppage. About 94% of Chicago teachers' union members voted in favor of the strike authorization, with demands for more staffing and lower class sizes. This is CTU President Jesse Sharkey.
We need staffing in areas like nursing, for social workers, and for special education services. We need enforceable caps on class size. And yes, we need pay and benefits too, but pay and benefits alone are not enough. We care deeply about the learning and working conditions in our schools.
This comes as about 7,000 school support staff with the Service Employees International Union have made preparations for a strike, as has over 2,000 Chicago Park District workers with SEIU Local 73. The Senate voted along party lines Thursday to confirm Eugene Scalia to succeed Alex Acosta as U.S. Labor Secretary. Scalia is the son of the late far-right Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia and a partner at the powerful law firm Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher. Scalia has a long history of opposing labor unions on behalf of corporate clients, including Walmart. Much of Scalia's legal work has been aimed at stopping the Dodd-Frank financial regulations enacted after the 2008 financial collapse. In West Papua, at least 32 people, many of them student demonstrators, were killed earlier this week in a brutal crackdown on anti-racism protests. Indonesian security forces reportedly opened fire on a group of protesting students at a university in Jayapura, killing 4. 28 more were killed in a separate uprising sparked by a teacher's racial slurs. The teacher reportedly called a high school student a monkey. The violence follows last month's escalating demonstrations calling for Papuan independence, which were also met by bloody repression from the Indonesian army. This is Edison Waromi, one of the leaders of West Papua, speaking at the Democracy Now! Studio here in New York Thursday.
Today is a time life in a slow motion genocide. We will die, continue every day, every moment.
And in Mexico City, thousands of protesters marched Thursday demanding justice for 43 student teachers who disappeared 5 years ago after they were abducted from the Ayotzinapa Rural Teachers College in 2014. This is Felipe de la Cruz, father of one of the missing students.
La situación de los padres dolorosa. The
situation of the parents is painful, exhausting, and distressing, but strengthened by all the support we receive from the population, from civil society, and the new government, because we are sure we will learn the truth and the criminals will pay.
Meanwhile, family members of the victims held a demonstration on the floor of Mexico's Congress, holding up images of their missing loved ones. Mexican officials said Thursday prosecutors were beginning new lines of investigation, and the government is offering a 1.5 million peso reward for information. But so far, investigators say they haven't turned up any new leads. A previous independent investigation found evidence the Mexican military was involved in the disappearances. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show in Washington, D.C., where more than 90% of House Democrats now support the impeachment of President Trump for pushing the president of Ukraine to investigate Democratic presidential candidate, his rival, Joe Biden, and his son, Hunter. On Thursday, a declassified version of a complaint by an anonymous whistleblower was released. In the 9-page document, an unnamed government whistleblower who's been identified as a CIA official, writes, quote, "The President of the United States is using the power of his office to solicit interference from a foreign country in the 2020 U.S. election," unquote. The complaint also revealed details about how the White House attempted to lock down all records of Trump's phone conversation with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky soon after it happened by moving a transcript of the call to a standalone computer system reserved for code word level intelligence information. The whistleblower wrote in his complaint, quote, "According to White House officials I spoke with, this was not the first time under this administration that a presidential transcript was placed into this code word level system solely for the purpose of protecting politically sensitive rather than national security sensitive information," unquote. On Thursday, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi accused the Trump administration of a cover-up.
There is actions that are cover-up. Yeah, when you have a system of electronic storage for information that is specifically for national security purposes, and you have something that is self-serving to the president politically, and decide it might not be, you might not want people to know, and you hide it someplace else, that's a cover-up.
Meanwhile, President Trump lashed out at the whistleblower and White House officials who spoke to him. During remarks at a closed-door gathering of diplomats on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly in New York, Trump compared the whistleblower to a treasonous spy. Audio of his remarks was leaked to the Los Angeles Times.
Who's the person who gave the whistleblower the information? Because that's close to a spy. You know what we used to do in the old days when we were smart, right? The spies and treason. We used to handle it a little differently than we do now.
Trump also called reporters scum and animals. Trump's comments came hours after Acting Director of National Intelligence Joseph Maguire testified on Capitol Hill and defended his handling of the whistleblower's comment, but also said he felt the whistleblower had acted in good faith. We're joined right now by James Risen, The Intercept's senior national security correspondent. He published 2 pieces in The Intercept this week, including a piece headlined, "I wrote about the Bidens and Ukraine years ago. Then the right-wing spin machine turned the story upside down." James Risen is a former New York Times reporter. He was pursued by both the Bush and then Obama administrations as part of a 6-year leak investigation into his book State of War, The Secret History of the CIA and the Bush administration. So, Jim Risen, we have a lot to talk about here. First, can you talk about the revelations in Washington, the significance of this whistleblower coming forward, even the Director of National Intelligence saying that he did the appropriate thing, the whistleblower, moving within the system, filing his complaint. Explain everything that's happened so far.
Yeah, well, there is a lot to cover. I think, to me, this just shows, as I wrote yesterday, that Trump is a habitual criminal. This phone call with the Ukrainian president happened the day after Robert Mueller testified before Congress, basically wrapping up the Mueller investigation. So he starts in with the Ukraine attempting to get the Ukraine to interfere in the U.S. 2020 election the day after Mueller completes his presence on the stage in terms of his investigation of the 2016 Russian interference. So I think this we have to step back and realize that this Ukrainian story is part of this larger picture of Trump constantly breaking the law, violating the norms of society, and trying to use his power to damage and his opponents and violate the Constitution. So I think if you look at it, I think one of the questions I now have is how many other countries has he done the same thing with that we don't know about yet? I think that the whistleblower is unique to me because very few whistleblowers have been able to go through the chain of command, the process set up for whistleblowers inside the government without retaliation or being fired or being stymied. And so most whistleblowers end up going to the press largely because they're frustrated by the internal system. In this case, the whistleblower was also clearly frustrated because the DNI refused to release this to Congress, and then the White House and the Justice Department both tried to quash it. And if you realize it, in the end, it was really only the leaks to the press about the existence of this whistleblower complaint that finally forced the White House and pressured the White House to comply with congressional demands that it be released. So even in this case, where the whistleblower followed the rules, it was only press leaks and the role of the press that finally forced it out into the open.
And explain what the rules are when you go through the formal process as a whistleblower, making a complaint like this, why it's supposed to go directly to Congress.
Well, I mean, the whole point of blowing a whistle about wrongdoing in the government is that you have to take it to another branch of government so that there are checks and balances. The law is set up so that intelligence whistleblowers can go outside of their own chain of command and take it to somebody who's not their boss and doesn't have the power to fire them, and to somebody inside the government who has oversight and can investigate the problem. The way that this idiot McGuire handled it was to go right to the White House and say, what should I do with it? When the White House was named in the complaint, and then he takes it to the Justice Department where Attorney General Barr is named in the complaint. I thought Adam Schiff's questions of McGuire were right on, and then McGuire had no good answer when he asked about why he did it this way.
Actually, we want to go to this clip. This is the House Intelligence Committee Chair Adam Schiff questioning Acting National Security Chief Joseph McGuire in Thursday's hearing.
Would you agree that the whistleblower complaint alleges serious wrongdoing by the President of the United States?
The whistleblower complaint involved the allegation of that. It is not for me in the intelligence community to decide how the President conducts his foreign policy or his interaction with leaders of other countries, sir.
Well, I'm not asking you to opine on how the President conducts foreign policy. I'm asking you whether, as the statute requires, this complaint involved serious wrongdoing, in this case by the President of the United States, an allegation of serious wrongdoing by the President of the United States. Is that not the subject of this complaint?
Yes, that is the subject of the allegation of the complaint. And two things, Mr. Chairman.
And let me ask you about that. The Inspector General found that serious allegation of misconduct by the President credible. Did you also find that credible?
I did not criticize the Inspector General's decision on whether or not it was credible. My question was whether or not it meets the urgent concern and the 7-day time frame that would follow once I was notified.
My question,
so
Director.
I have no question in his judgment that he considers it a serious matter.
That's Joseph McGuire, the Acting Director of National Intelligence, being questioned by Intelligence Chair Adam Schiff. Jim Risen.
I just think, in a way, I kind of pitied McGuire. He seemed like way in over his head. He had no idea what was really going on here. He's a Navy SEAL, has background, clearly was picked for this job because he's a nobody. after Dan Coates and Sue Gordon, his deputy, were both fired by Trump because he didn't like people who actually disagreed with him occasionally. This guy is clearly has no idea what was going on, and he was thrust into a situation that he didn't understand. So in a way, I kind of pity him, but he also should not have taken a job like this where he didn't really understand the parameters or the dynamics going on.
What about Attorney General William Barr? Lay out what we understand at this point his involvement in this story is.
Well, I think it's a little unclear, but in the phone call with the Ukrainian president, Trump says, I want you to talk to both my attorney, Rudy Giuliani, and the Attorney General, Barr, about the Bidens and help them get damaging information or make up damaging information about them so that we can then go after the Bidens. And the Justice Department has claimed now that that Trump never talked to Barr about this. So we don't really know whether that's true or not. But we do know that McGuire took the whistleblower's complaint both to the White House and to the Justice Department. And the Justice Department told him he didn't have to release it to Congress right away. And they also reportedly very, very quickly decided that there was no grounds for prosecution against Trump based on the idea that, which was similar to a similar reasoning that was in the Mueller report, which was that it's not a campaign finance law violation to seek opposition research from a foreign power because it's not, you can't prove that opposition research is a thing of value under campaign finance law. So they use the same legal reasoning that Mueller used in deciding not to prosecute the Trump Tower meeting between the Trump campaign officials and the Russian lawyer. I think it's a very, very weak argument, and they came to that conclusion in a very rapid way that they were obviously trying to shut this whole thing down before it ever got to Congress.
And the role of President Trump's private attorney, Rudolph Giuliani, who's going back and forth to Ukraine, but saying he's doing this on behalf of the State Department?
It's a bizarre, I've never seen anything like this. It's truly bizarre, and I don't know, it has to be clearly unethical or illegal. I mean, I'm wondering what laws cover his actions as a private citizen. It may be a violation of the Neutrality Act for a private citizen to engage in U.S. foreign policy, but that'll be something that Congress really should investigate, is what the hell was Rudy Giuliani doing, and how does he, what role is he playing? And who's paying him? Where is he getting his money from? Is it Donald Trump himself, or is it the U.S. government?
Well, of course, he's saying he's working on behalf of the State Department. And finally, President Trump seeming to throw Vice President Pence under the bus as well, as he's talking about these perfect and beautiful phone conversations he's had with the Ukrainian president. He also says you should check out Pence's as well.
Right. The thing about Donald Trump is he lies about everything all the time. And that one of the real problems I have with the press today is that the mainstream press quotes him all the time, knowing that he's lying about everything, and continues to treat him like he's really the president when he's just an illegitimate criminal. And he lies about everything. So why are we constantly quoting him and quoting his tweets and his statements when you know that everything that comes out of his mouth is a lie?
We're going to go to break, and then we're going to talk about the story that you reported, actually years ago, and that is the story of Hunter Biden in Ukraine. James Risen is a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter now at The Intercept, their senior national security correspondent. Stay with us.
my children, why do we build the wall? Why do we build the wall? We build the wall to keep us free, that's why. We build the wall, we build the wall to keep us free. How does the wall keep us free? My children, how does the wall keep us free? How does the wall keep us free? The wall keeps out the enemy, and we build the wall to keep us free.
Why We Build the Wall, sung by Billy Bragg, performing in our studio live here this week. Visit DemocracyNow.org to see his full interview and performance. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman as we continue with James Risen, The Intercept senior national security correspondent, best-selling author, former New York Times reporter, published 2 pieces in The Intercept this week, including one headlined, "I wrote about the Bidens and Ukraine years ago. Then the right-wing spin machine turned the story upside down." Jim Risen, tell us about what these allegations are, what Hunter Biden did in Ukraine, and then how it's been spun around.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of this is a very odd experience for me to see this story that I wrote 4 years ago come back in this weird way. In 2015, while Biden was vice president, I wrote about how he had just gone to the Ukraine to as sending a message really from the United States government and from other governments that the Ukraine had to crack down on corruption. And in particular, there was the prosecutor general of the Ukraine who had been refusing to do anything about major corruption cases in the Ukraine. And I wrote that this whole effort by Biden to get the Ukrainians to crack down was very awkward for him personally, and maybe even looked at as hypocritical, because his own son, Hunter Biden, was on the board of a company called Burisma, which was a Ukrainian natural gas company. And the British Serious Fraud Office was investigating Burisma and its owner, who was a Ukrainian official or former official, and that the British investigation had been stymied because the Ukrainian prosecutor's office had refused to turn over documents to the British officials, and as a result, the British effort to freeze Burisma's assets had been overturned by a British court because they couldn't get any documents from the Ukrainian prosecutor. And the money that had been frozen in banks in London immediately went offshore to Cyprus. Now, Hunter Biden was on the board of the company at the time that the assets were frozen. And he was on the board of Burisma at the time that his father took this trip to the Ukraine. But Joe Biden went there and said, "You've got to get rid of this prosecutor and you've got to crack down on corruption." The significance of his trip was that it was backed up by the whole Western world. There were several large Western countries that were demanding that the Ukraine fire this prosecutor and crack down on corruption. His actions to demand the firing of this prosecutor and to ask for a greater crackdown had the possible effect of making his son have even greater legal peril than he did by being on the board of Burisma, because it could have led to a more aggressive investigation of Burisma. Now, what has happened, so that's essentially what I wrote, but what I wrote was, this is very awkward and weird and bad for politically hypocritical for Biden, which was bad enough. But what happened since then is the whole right-wing spin machine got involved in this story over the last 4 years as they wanted to use it for opposition research in the 2020 election. And they now claim that Biden went there in order to protect his son and to get the Ukrainians to fire the prosecutor to stop him from investigating Burisma, which is the exact opposite of what happened. And so the original story I wrote was bad enough for Biden, but now it's been falsified by the Trump camp to make it look like Biden actually was using his position to protect his son, when that's not true.
Of course, President Trump is saying, continuing to say, investigate Hunter Biden. Now the former prosecutor general of Ukraine is saying Hunter Biden is not guilty. Talk about Vice President Joe Biden's role in dealing with the prosecutor general on this question of whether he was trying to force him out.
Yeah, I mean, he was the point that the United States was making. Biden was just really carrying a message for the United States government, for the Obama administration, which was you have to crack down more on corruption. And that the West felt that the prosecutor in particular was an obstacle to a crackdown on corruption. He was not leading any investigations. In fact, he was there are reports that he was trying to blackmail or get paid off by companies to stop investigations. So the idea, basically what's happened is that the right wing twisted this story to try to make it look worse for Biden.
And I'm wondering what you think of your former paper, the New York Times, writing, but if Trump can make 2020 another race between two unpopular nominees, if he can sully his opponent and make him another creature of the swamp, then he has a shot at victory. Imagine a world where the Ukrainian government enters the election on behalf of Trump. The president can now do to Biden what he did to Hillary Clinton in 2016, mire him in enough scandal and innuendo to undermine the vice president's claim to honesty. Crooked Hillary seamlessly becomes Crooked Joe.
Yeah, I think that's the whole point, was to try to make it look like, take corruption off the table for Trump as a problem. I mean, Trump has just emerged from the Mueller investigation looking really bad to a lot of Americans. But if he could make his opponent look dirty too, then that would level, as you say, level the playing field. So I think that was exactly the point of what they were trying to do with this story.
That was Jamel Bowie who wrote that in the Times. But James Risen, this whole issue of, first it was the Mueller report. And it didn't find collusion between President Trump and Russia in interfering with the 2016 election. And now Russia becomes Ukraine, and this possibility that people are going just to be infuriated that Congress is not doing its job to improve the conditions of the American people.
Right. Yeah, I think Nancy Pelosi has clearly tried to hold, she's been reluctant to go after impeachment because she has, a lot of exposed House, members in competitive districts that she was worried that would be hurt by this. But I think the Ukrainian revelations and disclosures by this whistleblower have made it almost impossible for her to ignore this. I think if you continued to ignore what Trump is doing, you're just going to aid and abet him and encourage him to break the law even more often. And so I think at some point, Congress has to stand up and say, okay, we have to be here and protect the rule of law.
Finally, President Trump speaking at the United Nations yesterday, and we've just played a bit of that recording, clearly very thrown by this whole situation. Of course, the impeachment inquiry continuing. He calls the press scum and animals. And he says the whistleblower, he should be dealt with, or the whistleblower should be dealt with in ways spies used to be. And it says he's guilty of, or she's guilty of treason. Talk about your own experience. This sort of puts together two things here, James Risen. You were pursued by both the Bush and Obama administrations. You were threatened with jail for not revealing a source. Talk about how you see how you were treated, not by Trump, but by President Obama's administration, and the trajectory through to now.
Yeah, I think one of the problems is that Trump is taking advantage of the path laid first by the Bush administration and then by the Obama administration in prosecuting whistleblowers under the Espionage Act, in which they are by definition treated as spies, and the whole way in which both Bush and Obama went after the press and tried to increase prosecutions of whistleblowers is led to this, finally we've hit bottom with Trump, who is, just using this kind of hateful language to undermine public servants who are trying to tell the truth. It's one of the most disgusting things about this administration, but it's also something that you saw the beginnings of in both the Bush and the Obama administrations. The use of the Espionage Act, both by Bush and by Obama and now by Trump, to prosecute people who talk to the press is by definition calling a whistleblower a spy. And so, Obama and Bush have led us to Donald Trump.
James Risen, I want to thank you for being with us. Intercept senior national security correspondent, best-selling author, former New York Times reporter, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, published 2 pieces this week. We'll link to them at The Intercept, including I wrote about the Bidens in Ukraine years ago, then the right-wing spin machine turned the story upside down. Author of State of War and Pay Any Price, Greed, Power, and Endless War. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, Sharif Al-Qudus joins us to talk about Egypt. Stay with us.
Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could save the world and all, simply by collecting up tin cans and empty bottles? We all want to believe it's true, but it don't matter what you do, so long as we continue to burn our way through fossils. Now it should come as no surprise to hear about the ocean's rise. Polar caps are melting with every year that the planet warms. Now people have to understand, we're gonna feel it far inland. It's gonna shift the seasons and supercharge the storm.
King Tide and the Sunny Day Flood by Billy Bragg, performing live in our studio this week. Visit DemocracyNow.org to see his full interview and performances. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn to Egypt, where thousands of protesters defied a police crackdown on dissent and took to the streets of Cairo and other cities today, demanding the resignation of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi over accusations of corruption. About 2,000 people have been arrested over the past week in growing demonstrations that were triggered when a former army contractor posted on social media accusing Sisi and other officials of misusing public money to build lavish palaces for Sisi's personal use. Widely posted Twitter hashtags, including "Sisi is not my president" and "Next Friday," referring to today's protests, also helped galvanize the uprising. Anti-government protests are rare in Egypt and have been effectively banned since Sisi came to power following the 2013 overthrow of former President Mohamed Morsi. Nadia Bounaim of Amnesty International called on the international community to oppose the government crackdown, writing in a statement, quote, "The government of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is clearly shaken to its core by the outbreak of protests and has launched a full-throttle clampdown to crush demonstrations and intimidate activists, journalists, and others into silence. The world must not stand silently by as President al-Sisi tramples all over Egyptians' rights to peaceful protest and freedom of expression, she wrote. Earlier this week, President Trump praised Sisi as the two leaders met during the UN General Assembly here in New York.
It's an honor to be with my friend, the President of Egypt, and he is a real leader. He's done some things that are absolutely amazing in a short period of time. When he took over not so long ago, it was in turmoil, and it's not in turmoil now. So I just want to say we have a long-term, great relationship. It's better than ever before. We're doing a lot of trading.
Trump also recently referred to the Egyptian President Sisi as my favorite dictator. For more, we're joined by Sharif Abdel-Quddus, Democracy Now! Correspondent reporter with the independent Cairo-based media outlet Madam Nasser. It's great to have you back here. You're covering the United Nations General Assembly. Sisi was there, and yet back in Egypt right now, 2,000 people have been arrested. Talk about the significance of this moment, Sharif.
Well, there was a very severe crackdown that happened following kind of these not unprecedented protests, but very rare, but very significant ones that took place on September 20th. And as you mentioned, this came on the back of this army contractor who worked on construction projects with the military for many years, dating back to the Mubarak era. He posted on social media this video. He's a little-known actor as well. And he accused Sisi
and where is he?
He's in Spain, in self-exile. He left. He sold much of his assets in Egypt, made millions, and went to Spain. And he posted these videos from there. And he accused Sisi by name and top generals by name of acts of corruption, of squandering funds on vanity projects. He was very specific, and it touched a nerve for, I think, two reasons. One is, of course, that Egyptians are suffering very deeply economically. This is on the back of years of austerity measures that came on the back of an IMF loan, $12 billion, that included very deep subsidy cuts to electricity and fuel. It included sales taxes. It included devaluation of the currency. The number of Egyptians living below the poverty line rose above 30% by government's own figures. So all of that came while people are really suffering economically. But also it was the way he spoke as well. He cast himself as a self-made man, kind of a street thug. He has a lot of charisma when he speaks. He didn't use the language of political rights or as a member of the opposition. It was, I made money with you. You stole my money. I want my money back. And this really kind of touched a nerve, I think, with a lot of people. And the response from Sisi, they organized very hastily a youth conference in Sharm el-Sheikh, where a one-day conference where Sisi responded. And he didn't refute the allegations really directly. He just said, yes, we're building presidential palaces, we're building a new state, and we're going to continue building more. And this just caused more people to come out. Wael Ghoneim, a figure from the 2011 revolution, many other people to do more of these videos, and it kind of snowballed into last week. And what we saw last week was people, mostly young men, in their late teens, early 20s, come out and protest. There was a very swift crackdown, as you mentioned, and we saw the biggest arrests sweep since Sisi came to power formally in 2014. Over 2,000 people have been arrested over the past week. Before that, the largest campaign was about 1,200 arrested in 2016 in protests over 2 islands being handed to Saudi Arabia. The majority of people who have been detained are young men. They're being held without access to their family or lawyers. But they've also detained prominent opposition figures as well, activists, journalists, political party leaders, university professors. They've even arrested lawyers who are attending interrogations with detainees at the prosecutor's office, including one, Mahinur al-Masri, who is quite well known and a human rights activist.
And she was there at the front line just trying to coordinate.
Yes, and this has happened, to a number of lawyers who work as human rights lawyers. They're at the prosecutor's office trying to get details of who's detained and and they're themselves detained. And we've seen on the streets a very vast security presence with plainclothes policemen in Tahrir and around downtown Cairo and in other cities across the country, stopping any young man that they see, taking their phone, making them unlock their phone, and then look through the contents on Facebook and Twitter to see if there's any political content and arrest them. They've been raiding homes. And there's also been disruption experienced on the internet, and cybersecurity companies like NetBlocks and others have documented this. So there's disruptions to things like Twitter, Facebook, and Skype, and also encrypted messaging apps like WhatsApp and Signal. And finally, also BBC News was blocked officially. The Supreme Media Regulatory Council said it was because it inaccurately reported on last week's protest. And the US government-funded outlet Al Hurra was also blocked as well. And they've joined about 500 websites which have been blocked over the past few years in Egypt, including the one I currently work for.
Your website?
Mada Masr, which is an independent media outlet in Egypt.
Has been blocked?
It's been blocked for about 2.5 years, yeah.
And you just mirror and mirror and mirror.
We put up mirrors and there's ways around it, but it's a little cat and mouse game. But I mean, and also I should say, just to finish, that as we're going to air right now, protests were called for after Friday prayer, which just ended maybe an hour and a half ago. The roads leading to Tahrir have been completely closed off. There's a security presence in there, very heavy police presence downtown. The Interior Ministry has said they will act with decisiveness against any what they called attempts to destabilize the country. Sisi has just landed from New York. He landed to a very managed and staged entrance with journalists and supporters waving flags, and he said there's no reason for concern. And finally, there's been pro-Sisi rallies organized by businessmen and celebrities and parliamentarians, and organized by the intelligence services, which are trying to counter the ones against Sisi. And they're actually being held in Rabaa Square, which is now called Hisham Barakat Square. But Rabaa Square is the site of the largest massacre in Egypt's modern history 6 years ago in August, where over 1,000 people were killed who were supporters of the former, now late, President Mohamed Morsi.
I want to go back to Sisi here in New York. On Monday at the United Nations, a reporter asked the Egyptian President el-Sisi and President Trump if they're concerned about the protests in Egypt.
No, I'm not concerned with it. Egypt has a great leader. He's highly respected. He's brought order. Before he was here, there was very little order. There was chaos. And so I'm not worried about that at all.
Let me say that you will always find something like this in our region, especially with political Islam. There have been efforts that have been put forth for many years to make sure that this political Islam is having a role on the political arena. And consequently, this part of the world will remain in a state of instability as long as political Islam is.
لكن المهم اللي انت لازم تكون متأكد منه.
But I want you to rest assured that especially in Egypt, the public opinion and the people themselves are refusing this kind of political Islam to rule Egypt. They have demonstrated their refusal before, and they refused those to have control on the country after only 1 year.
So that's the Egyptian President el-Sisi and President Trump. Trump didn't call him my favorite dictator, but he has called him that, and then respond to what Sisi said.
Right, well, the favorite dictator comment was reported by the Washington Post in a meeting at the G7 where Trump was waiting to meet Sisi, and he reportedly said, "Where's my favorite dictator?" And I think, as was reported, his aides, Trump's aides, and the Egyptian aides who were waiting were all looking at the ground, couldn't believe that he said something like that. But, you know, it is... there's a frankness to it. I mean, I think we have to remember Trump is an extension of what has been U.S. policy for many decades under successive Republican and Democratic administrations, which have supported Egypt through Mubarak and the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces and Mohamed Morsi, despite different types of human rights abuses, with diplomatic, military, and economic support. Trump, though, I think it is important that the rhetoric that comes from the administration does matter also. And when you have one of the biggest arrest sweep that's been happening in Cairo, and Trump sits and says there's no problem with that, Everyone has demonstrations. Sisi has brought stability. This really does give a green light for Sisi to crack down even further. Some administrations have used the State Department to speak out and say, you know, we urge him to use self-restraint and things of that nature. So that, I think there is an important factor in rhetoric, even though it is just rhetoric, and we have to remember that U.S. policy hasn't changed much. Also, you know, Boris Johnson, who just met with Sisi also during the UNGA, similarly praised the bilateral relationship between the UK and Britain. So we can see this as part of a larger change that's happening.
And then Sisi saying at this UN meeting, let me say you'll always find something like this in our region, especially with political Islam.
Right, he's trying to paint what's happening now, blaming it on the Muslim Brotherhood, which is, you know, the bogeyman, and Sisi's kind of raison d'etre was him coming to power is getting rid of them. And you know, I think this language can be familiar to many people here in the United States when they talk about Islamic terrorism and they try and blame everything on that. That's what Sisi's been trying to do. But this, I think any credible person can see that it has nothing to do with that. Finally, if we're looking at the U.S. response, the only, I think, presidential candidate who has said anything is Bernie Sanders, who tweeted a couple of times, most recently last night, saying the right of protesting is an international right and Egypt should exercise self-restraint. Senator Bob Menendez, Chris Murphy also tweeted similar things, as did a Congress member. His name escapes me. But I think we have to really watch what's happening right now in Egypt, because despite this, these are unorganized protests. There's no political movement backing this. Everything has been shut down politically for years now. So it's spontaneous, it's random, it's hard to call this a movement. But certainly I would say that something changed on September 20th, that there was a before and there was an after, and the way Sisi is viewed and the way he's talked about, and knowing that there's this widespread discontent just amongst people themselves, I think will reverberate and have a real effect.
Do you see a possible reprise of the Arab Spring?
No, I don't. I think that was a particular moment, and we have to remember that 2011, at least in Egypt and Cairo, and cities across the country, didn't just happen out of a vacuum. I think that's a dangerous way of looking at it. There was 10 years of organizing and movement building and politics happening. You know, up to 2 million workers went on wildcat strikes. All of these things brought what happened in 2011 together in a real movement. This is very different.
Has that all stopped from then to now?
There's been, you know, the fiercest repression in Egypt. Any group, any person who tries to do anything is quickly imprisoned, or they're subject to different kinds of penal measures. It's been very hard to do anything. Having said that, there is, I think, I'm always amazed by the bravery and perseverance of people in Egypt to continue their work and to continue pushing back despite the dangers of doing so. There's also a lot of talk that there's an internal struggle within the regime, that Muhammad Ali, this contractor, put up these videos, is somehow backed by elements within the regime that are dissatisfied with the way Sisi has handled things. Sisi has really lost a lot of popularity. There has been disagreement over those Red Sea islands that were handed over to Saudi Arabia within the regime, within the judiciary. They weren't happy about that. A former chief of staff of the military who dared to run against Sisi in the 2018 election was imprisoned for 10 years. And this is someone who was from the military establishment. So there's talk of things being backed, but it's very opaque and it's very hard to know.
How do you remain safe when you return?
I continue to do my work, but I don't think they focus on me too much.
I want to thank you so much, Sharif. Be safe. Sharif Abdel-Quddus, Democracy Now! Correspondent, reporter for Madamasra, an independent media outlet in Cairo. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnoff, Libby Rainey, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Masood, Trina Ndur, Taymari Astudio, and Maria Tarasena. Michael Filippo, Miguel Noguera, engineer. Special thanks to Julie Crosby, Miriam Barnard. I'm Amy Goodman.